Evelyn Mercer is 72 years old and believed the hardest years of her life were over until the night her own son shoved her through a glass door during an argument over house papers. Blood soaked into the white snow, and they called it an accident. But what they didn't know, the only thing keeping her standing that cold night, was a $21 million secret they never suspected. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Because these are the kind of stories you won't want to stop reading halfway through. Like and leave a comment letting me know which city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far my story has traveled in the world. I used to think I knew what betrayal felt like. I thought I understood it the way you understand something you've read about in a book. Abstractly, at a safe distance, with the quiet reassurance that it happened to someone else and not to you. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. The night of January 14th, I learned what betrayal actually feels like. Not the word, the thing itself. The physical weight of it, the specific cold of it. The way it doesn't arrive with any kind of warning you'd recognize as a warning until you're already on the other side of whatever line just got crossed. That was the night my son put his hands on me. I want to be careful here, because I've spent the months since that night turning it over and over in my mind, trying to find the version of it that makes the most sense, the version I can live with. There isn't one. There's only what happened. So I'm going to tell you what happened exactly as it happened, and I'm going to try not to dress it up or soften the edges of it, because the edges are the whole point. What? My name is Evelyn Mercer. I am 72 years old. I spent 31 years teaching middle school mathematics in the Covington School District, outside of Columbus, Ohio. And for 22 of those years, I did it while also raising a son mostly on my own after his father, Gerald, passed from a heart attack at 54. I'm not telling you that to ask for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand the kind of woman I am. I am a woman who shows up. I have always been a woman who shows up. That was never the problem. The problem, if I'm being honest, and I am trying to be, is that I loved my son in a way that left no room for doubt. And when you love someone like that, you don't see things clearly. You can't. The love gets in the way of the seeing. Dylan was 41 years old when all of this started. He worked in commercial real estate. Not particularly well, but he worked at it. And he had been married to Vanessa Cole for 6 years. Vanessa was the kind of woman who made you feel, from the very first moment you met her, that she was assessing you. Not unkindly, exactly, but precisely. Like she was calculating something behind those dark eyes, running numbers you couldn't see, deciding something about you that she would never actually say out loud. I tried to like her. I want you to know that. I tried for 6 years to find the version of Vanessa that my son saw, the one that made him smile the way he did when he talked about her, the one that somehow erased all the years before she existed. I couldn't find that version. But I kept trying because Dylan was my son, and that's what you do. I had a house. That's where all of this begins and ends. With a house. The house at 14 Birchwood Lane was a white 2-story colonial that Gerald and I bought in 1987 for $82,000. We painted the shutters green the first summer. We planted a pear tree in the backyard that Gerald was convinced would produce fruit within 2 years and didn't produce a single pear for 11. We raised Dylan in that house. We buried Gerald's father from that house. I cried in every room of that house at least once, and I laughed in every room of it more than I can count. It was worth, by the January in question, somewhere around $430,000, depending on who you asked. Dylan and Vanessa had been asking about it for 2 years. Not directly. That's not how Vanessa operated. It started with small things. Comments about how much upkeep an older home required. Observations about how the neighborhood was changing. Gentle suggestions. Always gentle. Always phrased as concern. That maybe it was a lot of house for one person. That maybe it made more sense for me to think about something smaller, something more manageable. An apartment, perhaps. A senior community with activities and people around. I was 71 years old and in better health than either of them. I didn't need a senior community. But I listened, because that's what you do when your child speaks, even when your child is 41 and your child's wife is the one who actually wrote the script. What I didn't know then, what I would only learn later, piece by piece, through a process that felt less like discovery and more like excavation, was that Dylan and Vanessa were carrying significant debt. Vanessa's boutique clothing business had failed in its second year. A condo investment Dylan had made in 2021 had gone badly sideways. They owed money on 3 different lines of credit and had been quietly borrowing against their own home for 18 months. They needed my house, not to live in, to sell, to liquidate, to use as the solution to a problem they had spent 2 years carefully hiding from me while simultaneously trying to charm, pressure, and maneuver me out of my own front door. I didn't know any of that on the night of January 14th. I only knew that Dylan had called me that afternoon and asked if he and Vanessa could come over to talk, that there was something important they needed to discuss, and that his voice had a particular quality to it that I hadn't heard before. Something tight and over-controlled, the way a voice sounds when the person behind it has already decided what the conversation is going to end with. They arrived at 6:15. Vanessa came in first, which was unusual. She usually let Dylan lead. That should have told me something, but I had the oven on and I was distracted, and she was already moving into my kitchen by the time I registered that the dynamic was different tonight. "Evelyn," she kissed my cheek. Her lips were cold. "It smells wonderful in here. You didn't have to cook." "I was going to eat regardless," I said. "You might as well eat too." Dylan came in behind her, gave me a hug that lasted less than a second, and then he was already moving through the kitchen and into the living room, his coat still on, his hands in his pockets. He didn't sit down. "We should talk before dinner," he said. "All right. We've been thinking a lot about the house." "I know you have." There was a pause. Vanessa was watching Dylan with the particular focus of someone who has rehearsed this with their partner and is waiting to see whether he remembers his lines. "We think it's time," he said. "We think you should sign it over. We can handle the property tax and the upkeep, and you wouldn't have to worry about any of it. You could just live here. Or not. We could look into other options for you, something more suited to where you are right now." "Where I am right now," I repeated. "Your age, Mom. That's all I mean." "I know what you mean." I turned back to the stove. I stirred the soup that didn't need stirring. I was trying to find the right words, the calm words, the words that would allow this conversation to end without destroying something I couldn't repair. I should have known by then that there were no such words, but I looked for them anyway. "I'm not signing over the house," I said. "It's my home. I've lived here for 37 years. It's paid off. It's mine. And I'm not signing anything over to anyone. Mom, Dylan." I turned to face him. "I'm not going to argue about this. I've told you before. The answer is no." That was when Vanessa spoke. "Evelyn." Her voice was careful, controlled. "I think you need to understand what we're dealing with here. Dylan is your son. We're not strangers asking you for something. We're family, and we are in a difficult position, and we are asking you, as family, to help us. I understand the position you're describing." "Do you?" She took a step toward me. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're choosing a piece of real estate over your own son." "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing? What is so important about holding on to this house that you'd watch Dylan struggle, watch us struggle, and not do anything?" "I've offered to help. In other ways. I've offered—" "We don't need the other ways." Dylan's voice cracked on that, just slightly. "We need the house, Mom. Okay? We need it. I can't— This isn't about sentiment. This is about survival." I looked at my son. I looked at the man that I had raised, that I had packed lunches for and driven to soccer practice and sat beside in every waiting room that life had produced, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen before. Not desperation exactly. Something colder than desperation. Something that looked like it had already settled into a decision. "No," I said. "I'm sorry for what you're going through. I truly am. But no." What happened in the next 4 minutes is something I've replayed so many times that it has taken on the quality of a film I've seen too often. The edges worn soft, the sound slightly off from the picture, the sequence almost too familiar to be real. But it happened. Every second of it happened. Vanessa began to cry. Not the soft kind of crying, but the loud, chest-heaving kind, the kind that fills a room and demands a response. She said things I won't repeat here, things about my selfishness, about how she had never felt welcomed in this family, about how I had always found ways to make her feel like an outsider. Dylan started pacing. The conversation stopped being a conversation and became something else. A pressure system, a weather event, something that had its own momentum now. I moved toward the back of the house. I was trying to create space between myself and the noise of it. I walked through the kitchen and toward the back hallway where the patio door was, the wide glass sliding door that looked out onto my backyard, and the pear tree that Gerald had loved so stubbornly. I don't know exactly how it happened. I've thought about it so many times, and I still can't reconstruct the geometry of it with complete certainty. Dylan was behind me. He was talking, or shouting. His voice had gone ragged by then, the controlled quality gone entirely. Vanessa was somewhere to my left. I reached the door. I put my hand on the handle. And then I was through it. Not sliding it open, through it. The glass exploded outward and I was falling, and the cold hit me all at once, the January cold, and my right arm went through the broken frame and I felt the cut before I felt the pain of the cut, the way you sometimes do. I was on the patio, on my knees and then on my hands, and then trying to understand what had just happened. Blood was dripping from my forearm onto the snow. Dylan was standing in the broken door frame. He was breathing hard. His face had the blank, stunned look of someone who has surprised themselves, who has crossed a line they didn't entirely plan to cross and hasn't yet caught up to what that means. "Mom, don't." My voice was very quiet. I didn't have the volume for anything else. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to. You were in the way, and I reached past you and the door." "Stop talking." Vanessa appeared beside him. She looked at me in the snow, and she looked at the blood, and something moved across her face. Not guilt, exactly, but the rapid calculation of a woman assessing damage. Then she said, in a voice that was nearly steady, "She should go inside. She's going to catch cold." She said it about me like I wasn't there, like I was a problem to be managed. I stayed on my knees for a moment, in the snow, with my blood on the white ground, and my son standing in the frame of my broken door. And I understood something. Not everything. Not the debt, not the documents, not the full scope of what had been building for 2 years. Just the essential thing. Just the truth that had been sitting under everything else, waiting for me to be still enough to hear it. They didn't see me as their family. They saw me as an obstacle. I got to my feet by myself. My arm was bleeding through my sleeve and the cold was sharp and complete, and I was shaking, but not from the cold, though the cold was real enough, but from the effort of holding myself together in the particular way that the moment required. I pressed my sleeve against the cut. I walked back through the broken door, past my son, past his wife, through my kitchen and into my bathroom. I locked the door. I sat on the edge of the tub, and I pressed a washcloth against my arm, and I listened to them in the other room. I could hear their voices, but not the words. After a while, I heard the front door close. I sat there for a long time after that. The washcloth went dark. I ran cold water over the cut, which was ugly but not deep enough for stitches, and I wrapped it, and I looked at my own face in the bathroom mirror for a while, the way you do when you're trying to make sure you're still inside the face you recognize. I was 72 years old. My son had just put his hands on me. His wife had watched me bleed in the snow and asked if I was going to catch cold. And I had a secret. I had kept it for 9 years, through the quiet accumulation of decisions that most people in my position never make, because they never think to make them. Gerald had left me more than Dylan had ever known about. Inheritance from Gerald's mother that arrived 5 years after his death, investments I had managed through a financial advisor. Dylan didn't know existed, property I had purchased under a separate name during the years when I had quietly, without announcement, decided that my future was my own business. $21 million. Not in this house. Not in anything they could see or touch or calculate. In trusts and accounts and structures that existed entirely outside the story they had been telling themselves about what I was worth and what they could take. That night, sitting in my bathroom with a wrapped arm and a very quiet mind, I made a decision. I was not going to react. I was not going to scream or threaten or call anyone in that particular moment of white-hot pain. I was going to do something much more difficult than any of that. I was going to be very, very still. And then I was going to dismantle everything they had built around me, piece by piece, document by document, with the kind of patience that comes from having spent 31 years teaching children that precision matters more than speed. I had time, I had money, and I had a security camera mounted above my back patio that had been recording since the previous October. I looked at my face in the mirror one more time. "All right, Evelyn," I said quietly, to the woman looking back at me. I turned off the bathroom light. The next morning, I woke up at 5:43, which is the time I have woken up for most of my adult life. And for a few seconds before full consciousness arrived, I was just a woman in her own bed in her own house, the way I had been for 37 years. Then I moved my right arm and felt the pull of the bandage, and everything came back at once. I lay there in the dark for a while, not crying. I want to be clear about that. I am not telling you this story from the perspective of a woman who spent those first hours falling apart, because I didn't. What I felt, lying in the dark with my bandaged arm against my side, was something closer to the feeling you get when a very loud noise suddenly stops. A kind of ringing stillness. A recalibration. I got up. I made coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the patio where Gerald's old folding chair was pushed against the wall, dusted with the snow that had come in through the broken door before I'd taped a sheet of plastic over it the previous night. The glass was still there on the pavers, some of it, the pieces I hadn't been able to sweep in the dark without cutting myself further. I drank my coffee and I looked at the glass and I thought, this is evidence. That was the first clear thought I had. Not what do I do about Dylan, not how do I fix this, just this is evidence and I need to not disturb it. The security camera was a Reolink model I'd installed the previous October, after a neighbor 2 streets over had her garden tools stolen from her shed. My neighbor Linda had suggested it. I hadn't thought much about it beyond the practical. I wanted to see if the raccoons were getting into the compost bin again, and the camera happened to cover the entire width of the patio and most of the back door. I hadn't told Dylan about it because it hadn't seemed relevant. It was relevant now. I finished my coffee and went to the small desk in the second bedroom where I keep my laptop, and I pulled up the camera app and I scrolled back to the previous evening. The footage was clear, better than I expected. The patio light had been on, and the camera's night mode had filled in the rest. You could see the back of my kitchen through the glass door. You could see movement. You could see with uncomfortable precision the sequence of events that had put me on my knees in the snow. I watched it twice. Then I plugged a USB drive into the laptop and saved every second of it. I closed the laptop and sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk, and I thought about my son. Not what he'd done. I was trying to set that aside for the moment, to keep it in a box where it couldn't cloud what needed to happen next. I thought about the version of Dylan that I actually knew, the one underneath the debt, and the ambition, and 6 years of Vanessa. The boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of the car on long drives and wake up pretending he hadn't been asleep because he was 11 and sleeping in the car was embarrassing. The man who called me every Sunday for 3 years after Gerald died, not because he had anything particular to say, but because he knew the Sunday evenings were the hardest. I thought about that Dylan, and then I thought that Dylan would not have let me bleed in the snow, which meant that the man who had stood in my broken doorframe last night was someone I needed to treat accordingly. Not as my son first, but as someone who had made a series of choices that required a response. Loving him and protecting myself from him were not mutually exclusive. It had taken me 72 years to understand that. I was not going to waste the understanding now that I had it. I picked up my phone and I called Claire Donovan. I had known Claire for 11 years since she represented me in a minor property dispute with a neighbor that had gotten out of hand over a fence line. She was in her mid-50s now, sharp-featured, with the kind of economy of movement that suggested she never wasted energy on anything she hadn't already decided was worth it. She was not warm in the conventional sense of the word. She was effective, which was worth considerably more to me at that moment. She picked up on the third ring. Evelyn. Not a question. She had caller ID and apparently used it. I need to meet with you, I said. Today, if possible. It's not the kind of thing I want to discuss on the phone. A short pause. Can you come at 2? Yes. Bring whatever documentation you have, anything related to the property, any communications, she paused again, anything else you think is relevant. I don't know if she heard something in my voice or if she was simply thorough by habit. Either way, anything else was exactly the right framing. I'll bring everything, I said. I spent the morning preparing, not frantically, that was never my way, but methodically, the way I used to prepare for a school year. I pulled the deed to the house, the property tax records, every piece of correspondence I'd received from Dylan and Vanessa over the past 2 years that related in any way to the house. There were more than I'd realized. Emails, A formal-looking letter from a title company that I now looked at with entirely different eyes than when I'd first received it, 6 months ago, and set aside thinking it was some kind of solicitation. It wasn't a solicitation, it was a preliminary title transfer inquiry that Dylan had apparently initiated without discussing it with me. The letter referenced his name as the initiating party and asked me to confirm my intention to proceed. I had never confirmed any intention. I had set the letter aside because I hadn't understood what it was, and because I had been in the habit, for too many years, of assuming that things with my name on them that came from official-looking sources were probably bureaucratic noise rather than the opening move in something I needed to pay attention to. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter in my hands, and I felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from finally understanding the shape of something you've been inside without knowing it. He had been working on this for 6 months, at minimum. I put the letter in the folder with everything else, and I drove to Claire's office. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. Her assistant, a young man with very neat hair who never seemed to remember my name despite my having been in the office at least a dozen times over the years, showed me in without a wait. Claire was standing at her window when I came in. She turned, looked at my arm. I was wearing a long sleeve, but the bandage made a visible ridge under the fabric, and said nothing about it immediately. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. I sat. I opened the folder. I put the USB drive on the desk between us. "Start with what's on that," I said. She picked it up. She plugged it into her computer. She watched the footage without expression, which was its own kind of expression. When it ended, she watched the last 40 seconds again, slowly, and then she looked at me. "When did this happen?" "Last night." "Have you sought medical attention?" "It didn't require stitches." "That's not what I asked." I hadn't. I knew she was right. "I'll go after this." "Go before," she said. "Go directly from here. I need documentation of the injury, photos, a medical record, a date stamp. Do you understand why?" "Yes." "Good." She leaned back. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Don't edit it." So I told her. All of it. The 2 years of pressure, the comments about the house, the letter from the title company, last night. I put the papers on her desk one at a time as I referenced them, and she read each one without interrupting me, and when I finished, she sat for a long moment with her hands folded on the desk and looked at somewhere slightly above my head, the way she did when she was organizing information. "The title transfer inquiry," she said finally. "Do you have the envelope it came in?" "No." "Doesn't matter. We can pull the filing." She tapped the letter. "This is more significant than it might appear. If he initiated this without your knowledge or consent, we're looking at potential fraud. Depending on what else we find, possibly elder financial abuse, which is a separate statutory category in this state with its own civil and criminal teeth." "I want to understand all of it," I said. "Every piece of what they've done. I don't want to go into whatever comes next with gaps." "That's exactly the right instinct." She paused. "Evelyn, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "All right. Is there anything about your financial situation that Dylan doesn't know? Assets, accounts, holdings that exist outside of what he would reasonably have knowledge of?" I looked at her for a moment. "Yes," I said. She didn't react with surprise. She just waited. "Substantially, yes," I said. "How substantially?" $21 million, roughly, in various trusts and accounts under separate legal structures. He has no knowledge of any of it." Claire looked at me for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "All right. Then the first thing we're going to do is make absolutely certain it stays that way. And then we're going to talk about what you want the next 12 months to look like." That was the moment I understood that I had chosen the right person. I went to the urgent care clinic directly from Claire's office, the way she'd asked. The physician on duty, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Dr. Okafor, cleaned and redressed the cut and asked me, with careful neutrality, how it had happened. I told her the truth. She documented it, took 3 photographs, and said, quietly, that she was required to note in the record that the injury was consistent with contact with broken glass in a domestic setting. "That's accurate," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "Are you safe?" "I'm working on it," I said. She nodded. She gave me her card with her direct number written on the back. I kept it. Over the next 3 days, Dylan called me 4 times. I let all 4 calls go to voicemail. I didn't listen to the messages. I knew what they would contain. Some version of the word accident, some version of an apology that was actually a request for me to reframe what had happened in a way that was more comfortable for everyone. I wasn't interested in comfortable reframing. I was interested in facts. Vanessa texted me once, a single message that said, "Evelyn, I hope you're feeling better. Dylan is very upset about the misunderstanding. We'd love to talk when you're ready." I screenshotted the message and sent it to Claire. On the 4th day, I drove to the Covington Public Library, where I had a long-standing relationship with the research librarian, a methodical man named Howard, who had helped me with various projects over the years, without ever asking too many questions about why I needed what I needed. I sat in the back room with Howard's assistants and I requested property records, financial filings, business registration documents, and court records for Dylan James Mercer and Vanessa Ann Cole, going back 7 years. What Howard pulled up over the course of that afternoon rearranged the landscape of the previous 2 years in a way that was, in its own terrible way, almost clarifying. Because the picture that emerged was not of a son who had made some bad decisions and gotten desperate. It was the picture of a sustained, deliberate effort, dating back further than I had realized, to position themselves for access to my assets. Vanessa's clothing business had failed, yes, but before it failed, she had taken out a business loan using a projected inheritance from a family estate as part of her financial documentation. The family estate in question, based on the timeline of the loan application, could only have referred to my property. She had used the expectation of my house as collateral for a debt I had never agreed to stand behind. I sat in the library for a while after Howard printed that document. "You all right?" Howard asked. "Fine," I said. "Thank you, Howard. You want me to pull anything else?" I thought about it. Business partnerships. Anything filed in the last 3 years with either of their names on it. He was back in 15 minutes with 2 more documents. A limited liability company formed 18 months ago, Mercer Cole Property Holdings, LLC, with both of their names listed as equal managing members. The company's stated purpose was residential property acquisition and management. They had already created the structure. They had already built the container for my house. They were just waiting for me to sign it over. I folded the papers carefully and put them in my bag. I drove home. I sat in Gerald's armchair, the one I'd kept in the living room long after it stopped matching anything else in the room, because it had been his, and the shape of it still held something I wasn't ready to let go of. I sat there for a long time, in the gathering dark of a January afternoon, and I thought about what Gerald would have said about all of this. Gerald had been a quiet man, careful with his words, careful with his money, careful about people in a way that I had sometimes, when we were young, found a little cold. He had never trusted Vanessa. He had died before Dylan brought her home, but I had told him about her during a conversation that I kept returning to. One of the last long conversations we had during his final hospital stay, when the machines were doing more work than they should have had to, and he was very tired but very clear. "Watch out for the people who need something from you," he said. "They always look like love at first." I had thought at the time that he was speaking generally. Now I understood that some part of him had been speaking specifically, across a distance of years he wouldn't live to see, to exactly this moment. I pulled out my phone and I called my financial advisor, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had managed my accounts through the same quiet, meticulous firm I'd used for 9 years. Patricia was in her early 60s, careful and competent, and blessedly unemotional about money in a way that I had come to deeply appreciate. "Evelyn," she said, "I was going to call you next week. Some of the quarterly distributions are coming up." "I need to move faster on something," I said. "Can we talk tomorrow?" "Of course." "What are we moving faster on?" "Everything," I said. "I want to restructure everything. I want to talk about moving the primary accounts into irrevocable trusts. I want to discuss the foundation timeline, and I want to make sure that there is no legal pathway, none, by which any of my assets could be claimed by or transferred to my son or his wife without my explicit, documented, witnessed consent." A pause. Not a surprised pause exactly. More the pause of a professional who is recalibrating the scope of a conversation they thought they already understood. "I'll need a few hours to pull together some options." "Take whatever time you need," I said. "Tomorrow afternoon?" 2 o'clock. I hung up. Outside the window, the sky had gone the particular shade of deep blue that January evenings make before they go fully dark. The pear tree in the backyard was bare, just the skeleton of it against the fading light, and I looked at it and thought about Gerald planting it, believing with that stubborn private conviction of his that it would produce something, that the work would eventually be worth the wait. He had been right about that. He had just underestimated the timeline. The meeting with Patricia the next day was 3 hours long and covered more ground than I had fully anticipated, which is saying something given how much ground I had planned to cover. Patricia laid out 6 different trust structures, walked me through the tax implications of each, and helped me understand, in clearer terms than I had ever had before, exactly how insulated my assets were from outside claims, and how much more insulated they could become. The answer was considerably more. The primary structure Patricia recommended was a combination of 2 irrevocable trusts, one for the bulk of the liquid assets, one for the investment properties, with a third entity, a charitable foundation organized under its own bylaws, as the ultimate beneficiary of both. The foundation would have a board, an independent trustee, and a documented charitable mission. Once established, neither Dylan nor Vanessa, nor, Patricia noted with characteristic directness, any court-ordered settlement short of a criminal restitution judgment could touch it. The foundation, Patricia said, tapping the draft document. You've been talking about this for 2 years. Do you have a clearer sense of the mission now? I did. I had been thinking about it since the night on the patio, with the specific clarity that comes from having lived the thing you want to address. Women over 60, I said, who've been financially exploited or left behind by families who decided they were past usefulness. Housing assistance, legal support, educational resources. The things that make the difference between someone being able to rebuild and not. Patricia looked at me for a moment. That's specific. It's meant to be. She nodded and wrote something at the top of the page. I'll have the initial filing documents ready by Friday. We should also talk about the house on Birchwood Lane. What about it? If you want to maintain it as a personal residence, we can structure that separately. If you eventually want to transfer it, the foundation can receive it. But I'd recommend keeping it out of the trust structures for now. Cleaner, easier to manage, and your legal team may want it available as a discrete asset in any proceedings. I thought about the house, the pear tree, the green shutters that had faded to something closer to sage over the years. Keep it separate for now, I agreed. I signed the preliminary documents that Friday. Patricia's firm began the transfer process the following Monday, and it was the following Monday that Dylan showed up at my front door for the first time since January 14th. I saw him through the front window before he knocked. He was standing on the porch in a wool coat I'd given him for his birthday 3 years ago, his hands in his pockets, looking at the front door the way you look at something you're not sure will let you in. He looked thinner than he had 2 weeks ago. There were lines around his mouth that I didn't remember, or maybe had been choosing not to see. He knocked. 2 careful, measured knocks. Not urgent, almost tentative. I opened the door. We looked at each other through the screen door. I didn't open the screen. Mom, his voice was rough. I know you've been avoiding my calls. I have been. Can I come in? No. He blinked. I don't think he had expected that word to come so cleanly, without cushioning. Mom, Dylan, I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to ask you to listen without interrupting me. I kept my voice level. Not cold exactly, just level. The way I used to speak to students who were on the edge of something they couldn't take back. What happened 2 weeks ago was not an accident. I know that. You know that. The camera above the patio recorded all of it, and I have that footage, and my attorney has a copy of it. I also have documentation of the title transfer inquiry you filed 6 months ago without my knowledge. I have records of the LLC you and Vanessa created 18 months ago. I have a complete picture of what the last 2 years have looked like from the outside. His face changed. The something that moved across it was not just guilt. It was the specific shift of a man realizing the ground under a structure he built has moved. Mom, the title inquiry was just, I was exploring options. I wasn't trying to, I said once, and without interrupting. He stopped. I love you, I said. I have loved you every day of your life, and I will continue to love you. But love is not the same as access. Love is not the same as surrender, and I will not sign anything, hand over anything, or allow any further pressure regarding my property, my finances, or any other aspect of my life that you have decided you have claim over. If you want a relationship with me that is based on something other than what you can take from me, that door. I paused on the word because the door between us was a screen and I was not opening it, is something we can talk about. Not today, but eventually. Dylan stood on my porch for a long moment. His jaw was working the way it used to when he was young and trying very hard not to cry. And I recognized that in him, that particular effort, and it hurt in the way that some true things hurt. Not because they're wrong, but because they're real. "What about the house?" he said finally. His voice was very quiet. "The house is mine," I said. "It will remain mine. What happens to it after I'm gone is my decision, and I have made arrangements accordingly." Arrangements. He said the word like he was trying to find the edges of it. "What does that mean?" "It means you should speak to your own attorney," I said. "And Dylan." I waited until he looked at me directly, until the eye contact was real and not performative. "Whatever happens next in a legal sense, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because the alternative is allowing my own family to treat me like I don't matter. And I have decided, it took me longer than it should have, but I have decided that I matter." He left without another word. I watched him walk down the porch steps and get into his car and sit there for a while before he pulled away. I stood at the window after his car turned the corner, in my living room that still smelled slightly of the plastic sheet I'd taped over the patio door, and I let myself feel, just for a minute, all the grief of it. The specific grief of loving someone who has shown you something about themselves you cannot unknow. Then I went to the desk in the second bedroom and I opened my laptop and I sent Claire an email telling her that Dylan had made contact, that I had not allowed him entry, and that I had informed him of the general existence of the footage and the documentation without specifying details. Her reply came 12 minutes later. "Perfect. Don't let him in again without counsel present. I'm filing for a protective order tomorrow morning. Also, I found something you need to see. Can you come in Thursday?" I stared at that last line. She had found something. I typed back, "I'll be there at 9. Whatever it was she had found, whatever new layer of this thing was about to surface, I understood in that moment that we were no longer in the phase where I was reacting. We were in something different now, something I was driving. The protective order was filed on a Tuesday. Claire served both Dylan and Vanessa with copies by Wednesday afternoon. I didn't hear anything from either of them for 48 hours, which was its own kind of communication. Thursday morning, I was in Claire's office at 9 o'clock. She was already there when I arrived, standing at the small conference table rather than her desk, papers spread out in a pattern that suggested she'd been working since early. She handed me a set of stapled documents before I'd fully sat down. 2 months ago, she said, Dylan Mercer signed a power of attorney document that listed himself as your legal representative in matters related to your primary residence. I looked at the papers. "I never signed that," I said. "No." Claire's voice was very quiet and very precise. "You didn't. Your signature on the document is a forgery." The room was very still. I looked at the signature on the page. It had my name, shaped approximately like my name, but the curve of the capital E was wrong, and the final R of Mercer rose instead of falling the way mine did. It was close. Close enough to pass a casual inspection, not close enough to pass mine. "He forged my signature," I said. "Yes." "To give himself legal authority over my property." "Yes." I set the papers down. I was holding myself very still, the way I'd been holding myself very still for 3 weeks now, and I was aware that underneath that stillness was something that had a great deal of pressure behind it. I was aware of it the way you're aware of the wind before a storm. By the way, everything else gets quiet. "What does this mean?" I said, "in terms of what we do next?" Claire looked at me steadily. "It means," she said, "that we're no longer talking about elder pressure and a property dispute. We're talking about document fraud, financial coercion, and a pattern of elder abuse that has been building for at least 2 years. She paused. "Evelyn, this goes to the district attorney." I thought about Dylan sitting in his car at the end of my driveway after I'd closed the door on him. I thought about Vanessa's text message, a misunderstanding. I thought about my arm, the bandage I'd changed 4 times already, the scar that was going to stay. "Then that's where it goes," I said. What I didn't tell Claire that morning What I was still turning over in my own mind, examining from different angles the way you examine something fragile, was that I had already made a decision that went beyond the legal process, beyond anything a court could order or a judgment could produce. That night, sitting again in Gerald's armchair in the failing light, I pulled out the preliminary documents Patricia had prepared for the foundation. I read them through from beginning to end, not for the first time, but with a different quality of attention than before. I read the mission statement I had drafted, the one about women over 60 who had been discarded by families who'd decided they were no longer worth protecting. I thought about how many of those women there must be, how many of them were sitting in their own armchairs right now, in houses they were being maneuvered out of, by people they had once rocked to sleep and driven to soccer practice and loved without condition or caveat. How many of them had no security footage, no financial advisor, no attorney who picked up on the third ring? How many of them had no $21 million quietly assembled against exactly this kind of storm? I was not naive enough to think that what was coming would be easy. The legal process was going to be long and ugly, and there would be days I did not want to get out of bed. Dylan would hire his own attorney, and that attorney would say things about me in formal documents that I would have to read with my own eyes. Vanessa would find her own version of the story, and she would tell it loudly. But they had made one miscalculation that I don't think either of them had ever stopped to examine. They had looked at me and seen a 72-year-old woman living alone in an old house, and they had decided that alone was the same as vulnerable, that quiet was the same as weak, that the years had worn me down rather than sharpened me. They had built an entire strategy on a misreading of who I was. I closed the foundation documents. I set them on the side table where I'd been stacking things that needed signing. I looked at the pear tree through the back window, bare against the January dark. In the spring, I thought, it would bloom again. It always did. The district attorney's office assigned the case to an investigator named Russell Page, a compact, unhurried man in his early 50s who wore the same style of dark gray suit every time I saw him and asked questions the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, without wasted motion, cutting exactly to the thing he needed. He came to my house on a Tuesday morning in early February, sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a voice recorder, and spent 2.5 hours going through everything. I had been interviewed before, in smaller ways. A deposition once, years ago, over a contract dispute that never amounted to much. This was different. Russell Page was not interested in my feelings about what had happened. He was interested in sequence, documentation, and corroboration. He asked me to walk him through every interaction I could remember with Dylan and Vanessa over the preceding 24 months that related to the house, to my finances, or to any pressure regarding either. He stopped me frequently to clarify timelines, to ask whether I had documentation for specific things I mentioned, to establish which conversations had been witnessed by anyone other than the three of us. Most of them hadn't. That was the design of it, I understood now. The pressure had been applied in private, in my own living room, behind a closed front door, in the accumulated weight of many conversations that each seemed, in isolation, like nothing more than family discussion. It was only when you laid them all out in sequence, the way Russell Page was doing with his legal pad, that the architecture became visible. The deliberate, patient, incrementally escalating architecture of people who had decided that the most efficient path to what they wanted was to make me feel that signing it away was my own idea. Did you ever feel physically unsafe prior to the incident on January 14th? Russell asked. I thought about that carefully. Not physically, I said, but there were moments where I felt cornered, emotionally cornered, where the conversation had been constructed in a way that made any response I gave seem like the wrong one. He wrote something. Can you give me a specific example? Thanksgiving, I said. 2 years ago. Vanessa made a comment at dinner about how she'd always wanted to live in a house with history, a real family home. She said it looking directly at me, and then looked away and changed the subject before I could respond. And then Dylan said, immediately after, that it was a shame houses like this one got passed on to strangers instead of staying in families. I paused. It sounds minor when I say it out loud. It doesn't, Russell said. He didn't look up from his pad. What did you say? Nothing. I passed the sweet potatoes and changed the subject, because I told myself I was reading into it. I heard the particular flatness in my own voice when I said that. I spent 2 years telling myself I was reading into it. Russell Page nodded once and wrote something else. When he left, he took copies of everything: the footage, the forged power of attorney, the title inquiry letter, the LLC documents, Patricia's records showing the timeline of attempts to access information about my accounts, which had included 2 phone calls to Patricia's firm from someone identifying himself as my authorized representative, Dylan. Calling Patricia's firm, which he had no knowledge of me using, which meant he had been looking, digging, searching the edges of my financial life for openings. Patricia had not given him anything because he had not been on my account in any capacity, but the calls were logged, and the logs were now in Russell Page's file. After I stood at the kitchen sink and ran the water cold and held my wrists under it for a while, which is something I'd started doing when the weight of all of it got too heavy to hold in a normal posture. The cold water helped. I don't know why exactly, but it did. The protective order that Claire had filed came through the following week. The terms were specific. Dylan Mercer and Vanessa Cole were prohibited from making contact with me by any means, from coming within 100 yards of my home, and from taking any action related to my property or finances without court authorization. A copy was served to both of them. Claire texted me a single line when it was confirmed. Done. Now we wait for them to make a mistake. They didn't wait long. It was Vanessa who moved first, which didn't surprise me. Dylan had always been reactive. Vanessa was the one who acted when she felt the structure shifting. 11 days after the protective order was served, she filed a counterclaim alleging that I was mentally incapacitated and requesting that the court appoint Dylan as my legal guardian. I found out from Claire, who called me at 7:30 in the evening. I was in the kitchen making soup, and when she told me, I turned the burner off and sat down at the table and held the phone with both hands. "She's claiming I'm incompetent," I said. "She's claiming cognitive decline. Specifically, she's alleging that your recent financial decisions, the trust transfers, the foundation, are evidence of impaired judgment, and that Dylan, as your closest family member, is the appropriate person to manage your affairs." The precision of it was almost impressive. If it had worked, if they had managed to establish legal guardianship before I had restructured my assets, Dylan would have had formal court-ordered authority over everything I owned. The transfers to the trust might have been challengeable. The foundation might have been blocked. Vanessa had understood, once the protective order landed on her doorstep, that the conventional approach was closed, and she had pivoted to something more surgical. "Can she do that?" I asked. "Realistically, she can file it," Claire said. "Making it stick is another matter entirely. A competency determination requires a formal evaluation by a qualified psychiatrist, and given your documented history, your professional career, your financial management, the coherent and legally sound decisions you've made over the past several weeks, the bar they'd have to clear is extremely high." She paused. "Evelyn, this is a desperation move. She's throwing something at the wall because the wall is closing in." "It doesn't feel like a desperation move," I said. "It feels like someone trying to take the last thing I have." "I know, but here's what we do." And Claire laid it out efficiently, the way she always did. We would file immediately for a voluntary psychological evaluation with a clinician of my choosing, get ahead of the narrative, generate our own documentation. We would also file a motion to have the counterclaim dismissed as retaliatory, given the timing relative to the protective order, and we would use the counterclaim itself as additional evidence of the pattern of harassment. "Every move they make," Claire said, "makes our case stronger." "I'll remember you said that," I told her. The psychological evaluation was conducted 2 weeks later by a Dr. Marlene Voss, a clinical neuropsychologist at a teaching hospital 40 miles from Covington, who had testified in competency cases for 23 years and had, Claire told me, a reputation for being rigorously objective and unpleasant to challenge on cross-examination. She spent 4 hours with me over 2 sessions. She administered the standard battery of assessments, asked me to walk her through my decision-making process on the financial restructuring in detail, reviewed my professional history, and spent the last 40 minutes of the second session simply talking with me about nothing in particular, about teaching, about Gerald, about what I had planted in the garden the previous spring. She shook my hand at the end of the second session and said, with the clipped precision of a woman who chose her words carefully, "You should know that I write what I find, not what anyone wants me to find. But I'll tell you this much. I've evaluated a great many people under pressure over the years. You're one of the clearest thinkers I've met in any context. Whatever's happening in your family, it isn't about your cognition." I thanked her. I got into my car in the hospital parking garage and sat there for a few minutes without starting the engine. Something that had been compressed in my chest for weeks loosened slightly. Not all the way, but enough. The report arrived at Claire's office 10 days later. Dr. Voss found no evidence of cognitive impairment, memory disorder, or compromised decision-making capacity. Her language was technical and precise, and in certain passages, pointed in a way I suspected was intentional. She noted specifically that the financial decisions in question reflected sophisticated long-range planning consistent with the subject's documented professional and personal history, and that the characterization of those decisions as evidence of incapacity was inconsistent with any recognized clinical framework. Claire filed the report with the court the same morning it arrived. The counterclaim was still pending, but its foundation had been systematically removed. I could feel the shift in the structure of things. The way a building feels different when you remove the false walls and find out what was actually holding the weight. It was around this time that I started spending Thursday evenings at a community center on the east side of Covington, in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning products and weak coffee, with a group of 9 other women who were, in various configurations and at various stages, dealing with situations that rhymed uncomfortably with my own. A social worker named Denise had organized the group 2 years earlier. She had found me through a mutual acquaintance and called to ask if I'd be willing to come and talk. Not about the legal details, nothing that would compromise the case, just about the broader experience. I almost said no. I am, by nature, a private person. The idea of sitting in a circle with strangers and talking about my son felt like a violation of something, even if the violation had already been committed by someone else. But I went, the first Thursday, and I listened more than I talked, and by the end of the evening I had changed my mind about what I was there for. There was a woman named Beverly, 68, whose daughter had emptied her savings account over a period of 3 years by making small transfers that Beverly had assumed were for household expenses. Beverly had only discovered it when she went to pull money for a medical copay and found a balance of $43. There was Miriam, 74, whose son had had her sign documents during a period when she was recovering from hip surgery and heavily medicated. Documents she later learned had transferred her car, her jewelry, and her right to remain in her own home into his name. There was a woman who asked to be called only by her first initial, P, who had simply stopped speaking in complete sentences about what had happened to her, but who came every Thursday and sat with her hands folded in her lap and occasionally nodded when someone else said something that landed close to her own experience. I sat in that room every Thursday, and I understood something that I had been circling for weeks without quite landing on. What had happened to me was not unusual. It was not a story about one bad son and one calculating wife. It was a story about a pattern so common it had its own legal category, its own social services infrastructure, its own literature. The exploitation of older women by the people they trusted most. The slow, patient dismantling of someone's autonomy by the very hands that were supposed to hold her up. The difference between me and Beverly and Miriam and P was not that I was stronger or smarter or more deserving of a different outcome. The difference was that I happened to have resources they didn't: financial, legal, structural. And that difference felt, some Thursday evenings, less like luck and more like a kind of debt, like something owed. I started thinking about the foundation differently after those evenings. Not as an abstract moral statement, but as a specific practical instrument pointed at a specific. Women like Beverly needed attorneys like Claire. Women like Miriam needed financial advisors like Patricia. Women like P needed. Well, I didn't know exactly what P needed, but I was beginning to understand that figuring that out was the work. The trial date was set for the 14th of April, 3 months from the night on the patio. It felt simultaneously like a long time and like no time at all. In the weeks leading up to it, I watched Dylan and Vanessa's attorney, a man named Gordon Fitch, who had a reputation for aggressive procedural maneuvering, file a series of motions to exclude the camera footage on technical grounds, to challenge the chain of custody of the forged document, to characterize the LLC and the title inquiry as standard estate planning rather than evidence of financial coercion. Claire countered each one. I read the filings at night, at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I noticed that I had developed a new tolerance for legal language. 6 months ago, I would have needed Claire to translate. Now I could read the motions myself and understand not just what they said, but what they were trying to do. what they were designed to obscure or delay or reframe. Gordon Fitch was not a bad attorney. He was doing what his clients needed him to do, which was to create as much friction as possible between the evidence and the conclusion the evidence pointed toward. But he was working with a set of facts that had the particular inconvenience of being visible and documented and time-stamped. And there is only so much you can do with emotion when the underlying reality is on a USB drive that has already been authenticated and copied and stored in 4 separate locations. A week before the trial, Claire and I met for 3 hours in her conference room and went through everything. Every piece of evidence, the order in which it would be presented, what I should expect on cross-examination, how Gordon Fitch would try to rattle me, and how I should respond, which was not by getting rattled. "He'll try to make you emotional," Claire said. "He'll use language about your son, about the relationship, about family loyalty. He wants you to either cry on the stand or get angry on the stand. Either one plays into the narrative he's building, that you're too emotionally compromised to be a reliable witness." "I've had 4 months to process this," I said. "I know, but it's different on the stand. It's different when your son is sitting 10 feet away and his attorney is reading from a document and asking you to explain yourself." She looked at me steadily. "I need you to tell me if there's anything that you think could come up that we haven't discussed." I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, not the quick reassuring scan that it would have been easy to do. "There are things I wish I'd done differently," I said finally. "Earlier, years ago. I should have put firmer boundaries in place long before any of this came to a head. There were moments, before last January, before the pressure about the house, where I saw things that made me uncomfortable and I chose not to see them. Not consciously, but I chose. And if Fitch raises that, then I'll say exactly what I just said to you. I'm not going to pretend I was a perfect, prescient woman who handled everything correctly. I wasn't. But not handling something perfectly doesn't mean you deserve to be pushed through a plate glass door." Claire looked at me for a moment, and then she did something she had never done before in 11 years. She smiled. Not professionally. Actually smiled the way people do when something surprises them into it. "No," she said, "it doesn't." The morning of April 14th, I woke up at 5:43 as always, and lay in the dark for a moment, and took inventory of how I felt. Which was steady. Not confident exactly, because confidence has an edge of performance to it, and I was not performing anything, just steady. The way a table is steady. Not because nothing could knock it over, but because the weight is distributed correctly. I dressed carefully. Not to impress, but because the way you present yourself is a form of language, and I wanted to speak clearly. A dark blue blazer that I'd owned for 12 years, and that still fit well. The pearl earrings Gerald had given me for our 20th anniversary. Comfortable shoes because I was not going to be unstable on my feet for any reason on this particular day. I met Claire in the courthouse parking lot at 8:15. She looked at me once, top to bottom, with the evaluating efficiency she brought to everything, and said, "Good, let's go." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had been in that building twice before, for minor matters, and I had expected the trial to feel more monumental in terms of space. It didn't. It was a regular room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting and wooden benches and a smell of old carpet and case files, the mundane setting of enormous things. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Claire and her junior associate, Marcus, who was 29 and very quiet and had the habit of reading the same document 3 times consecutively, which I had come to find reassuring rather than nervous-making. Across the aisle, at the defense table, Gordon Fitch sat beside Dylan and Vanessa. I looked at my son. He was in a suit I didn't recognize, new or recently acquired, which meant Vanessa had dressed him for this. He was looking at the table in front of him. Vanessa sat beside him with the posture of someone who has decided that stillness is the same as confidence. She was wearing a camel-colored blazer and her hair was pulled back. She looked like a woman attending a business meeting. Her hands were folded on the table. She didn't look at me, which was its own form of communication. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Ellsworth, who was in her early 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and an expression of contained impatience that suggested she had seen every variation of human bad behavior in this room and was not interested in wasting any of her remaining professional years on performances. I appreciated that about her immediately. The opening arguments took 40 minutes. Claire was precise and chronological, building the timeline brick by brick. the 2 years of pressure, the title inquiry, the LLC, the forged power of attorney, the physical assault on January 14th. She didn't editorialize. She didn't reach for emotional language. She laid the facts in sequence and let the sequence speak, which was the right instinct, because the sequence was damning enough on its own. Gordon Fitch was smoother, in the way that smooth things sometimes are, aesthetically pleasing but not necessarily in contact with any actual surface. He characterized Dylan as a devoted son dealing with a complicated family situation, described the title inquiry as routine estate planning undertaken with good intentions, and suggested that the events of January 14th had been a tragic accident during an emotionally charged family disagreement. He used the word accident 4 times. He used the phrase deeply loves his mother twice. Dylan's jaw was tight throughout Fitch's opening. I could see it from across the aisle. Whether it was tight because he was moved by his own attorney's characterization of him, or because he understood how hollow that characterization was, I couldn't tell. Probably both. The footage was the first item of evidence Claire introduced. She had arranged for the courtroom's display screen to show it at full resolution, with the timestamp visible in the corner. The room went quiet in a particular way when it started playing. Not the hushed quiet of respect, but the dense, still quiet of people watching something they cannot look away from and cannot entirely absorb. You could see me in the kitchen. You could see the argument developing, figures moving, body language escalating, the contained then unconstrained nature of it. You could see me move toward the back door. You could see Dylan follow. You could see the moment. It was 18 seconds from the time I reached the door to the time I was on the ground. 18 seconds that had the quality of a much longer event when you watch them from the outside, in a quiet courtroom with a timestamp running in the corner. You could see Dylan's hand make contact with my back. You could see me lose my footing. You could see the glass. You could see me on the pavers, on my hands and knees, in the January cold. And you could see Vanessa standing in the doorframe beside Dylan, looking down at me in the snow, looking and not moving. Judge Ellsworth watched this footage with her reading glasses now on, leaning slightly forward. When it ended, she straightened up and made a note. Her expression had not changed, but something in the room had shifted. A slight movement of atmospheric pressure, like the moment before a storm finally decides to arrive. Gordon Fitch asked to address the footage immediately. He stood and walked toward the screen with the practiced ease of a man buying himself composure time, and he said that what the footage actually showed was a domestic situation that had escalated beyond anyone's intent, that Dylan had been attempting to move past his mother toward the door to get air, not to push her, and that the physical contact was unintentional. "Mr. Fitch," Judge Ellsworth said, in a voice like a classroom door closing, "I'm going to stop you there. I've watched the footage twice now, and I would like to review it a 3rd time before we proceed. Court will take a 15-minute recess." 15 minutes during which I sat at the plaintiff's table and did not look at anyone across the aisle and did not speak and kept my hands flat on the table the way I had learned to do when I needed the solidity of an actual surface under me. Marcus leaned over and said, very quietly, "She's going to review it frame by frame. That's what that means." "I know," I said. When court resumed, Judge Ellsworth spoke before either attorney could. "I've reviewed the footage and I have some questions for the defense." She looked at Gordon Fitch over her reading glasses. "In your characterization of the incident, you indicated that Mr. Mercer was attempting to move past the plaintiff toward the door. The footage appears to show the plaintiff already in contact with the door handle at the time of the physical contact. Can you explain to me what Mr. Mercer was moving toward, given that the plaintiff was already at the door?" A pause. Very short, but audible. "Your Honor, the intention—" "I'm asking about the physical reality, Mr. Fitch, not the intention." Another pause. Longer. "I would need to review the footage again with my clients to provide a precise answer." "You'll have the opportunity." She looked at her notes. "We'll proceed with testimony." I was called to the stand in the afternoon session, after the lunch recess during which I ate half a sandwich Claire's assistant had packed and drank a full bottle of water because my mouth had been dry all morning. I walked to the witness stand with my back straight and my hands quiet at my sides, and I looked at the courtroom from the elevated perspective of the stand and took one breath before Claire began. She walked me through the 2 years. I answered without elaboration, without emotion, in the conventional performative sense, just the facts as I knew them and could document them. The title inquiry, the LLC, The calls to Patricia's firm. The pressure regarding the house, what was said, by whom, in what circumstances. I spoke about January 14th the way I had spoken about it to Russell Page, sequentially, without reaching for language that would seem calculated to provoke sympathy. I had made peace with the fact that the footage was more powerful than anything I could say. My job on the stand was to be credible, to be precise, to be exactly what I was. Gordon Fitch cross-examined me for an hour and 20 minutes. He was good at it, patient, methodical, circling back to the same points from different angles, looking for inconsistencies in my timeline, testing whether I would get flustered or defensive. He asked about my relationship with Dylan, the full history of it, and there were moments in that questioning where the grief of it was genuine and close, and I had to hold it carefully, the way you hold something hot, without setting it down and without letting it burn you. He asked about the foundation, whether it wasn't possible that my decision to move $21 million into an irrevocable trust and charitable foundation, removing it entirely from the reach of my only living child, was a decision made in anger, a form of punishment rather than genuine philanthropy. No, I said. How can you be certain? Because I began thinking about the foundation before January 14th. I have documented discussions with my financial advisor dating back 2 years. The events of January 14th clarified the timeline. They didn't create the intention, but they accelerated it. They made it urgent, yes. So the events of January 14th did influence your decision. I looked at him directly. Everything that has ever happened to me has influenced my decisions, Mr. Fitch. That's how living works. The question is whether the decisions are sound. Dr. Voss addressed that. A small sound from somewhere in the courtroom benches. Not quite a laugh. Something close to it. Judge Ellsworth did not react. Fitch moved on. He asked, eventually, about the forgery. Whether I was absolutely certain the signature on the power of attorney document was not mine. Whether there was any possibility I had signed it and forgotten. I held his gaze for a moment before I answered, and in that moment I thought about Dr. Voss and her evaluation, and Patricia and her file of clean documented records, and Claire, who had known me for 11 years, and Russell Page, who had taken 3 hours of my time without wasting a single minute of them, and Denise's Thursday group, and Beverly and Miriam and P, and Gerald's armchair, and the pear tree, and the green shutters that had faded to something close to sage, and I thought about what it meant to be asked, at 72 years old, in a courtroom, by a man being paid to defend the people who had put me on my knees in the snow, whether I might have simply forgotten signing my own rights away. I am absolutely certain, I said. My signature curves in the opposite direction. I have written my name more than 100,000 times in my life, Mr. Fitch. I know what it looks like. That is not it. He paused. Then, no further questions. Dylan took the stand in the late afternoon. He testified for nearly 2 hours. His account of January 14th was careful and constrained and contained the word accident 11 times in total, which I counted because counting gave me something to do. Besides, look at his face and feel the particular complicated thing I felt every time I looked at his face. He said that he had never intended to harm me, that the physical contact had been unintentional, that he had been trying to de-escalate the situation. He said these things in the flat voice of someone reciting something that has been reviewed with an attorney many times, and from which the life has been largely drained by the process of review. Claire cross-examined him for 35 minutes. She was precise and quiet, and she did not let him wander. She asked him to explain specifically the purpose of Mercer Coal Property Holdings, LLC, formed 18 months before the incident. He said it was a general investment vehicle. Did you intend to include your mother's property in that investment vehicle? A pause. We discussed various options. Did you discuss them with your mother? Another pause. Not in formal terms. Did you discuss them with your mother in informal terms? We talked about the future of the house, yes. Did she ever express agreement to including her property in your LLC? He was quiet for a moment that stretched past the point of comfort. She was resistant. Resistant, Claire repeated without inflection. Thank you. Now, the power of attorney document bearing your mother's signature. Did you prepare that document? Fitch objected. Judge Ellsworth overruled. We had an attorney prepare it, Dylan said. It was meant to be signed at a later date. There was a miscommunication about the process. A miscommunication, Claire said. The document was filed with a county clerk's office. It bore your mother's signature. Your mother did not sign it. How does a miscommunication produce a filed document bearing a forged signature? The silence that followed that question had a particular texture to it. It was the silence of a room full of people who have been watching something assemble itself piece by piece and have now seen the last piece click into place. Dylan looked at his attorney. Fitch made a small gesture with his hand. Not quite a signal, but something. I don't have an answer for that, Dylan said. It was not an admission, it was not a confession, but in the context of 2 hours of testimony, of footage and documents, and an expert report and a forensic signature analysis that had been submitted into evidence that morning, it was something that functioned very similarly to both. Judge Ellsworth asked the bailiff to bring her a copy of the forensic signature analysis. She read 2 pages of it at the bench. Then she looked up. We'll recess until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said, at which point I would like to hear from counsel regarding the motion to extend the protective order, the criminal referral status, and the question of whether interim financial controls are appropriate given today's testimony. She looked at both tables over her reading glasses. I suggest both parties use this evening wisely. She stood. Room stood. She walked out. In the hallway after court cleared, Claire and I stood near the window at the end of the corridor, away from anyone else, while Marcus gathered the case files. The light through the window was the long golden light of an April evening, and it caught the dust motes in the air and made everything look briefly like it was suspended. How do you feel? Claire asked. I thought about it. The honest answer, the one I gave her, was, I feel like the truth finally had enough room. She nodded, looking out the window. Tomorrow is going to be hard, she said. The judge is going to push both sides, and Fitch is going to have something. He always has something. I know. But today, she stopped, started again. Today was real. What happened in there today was real. I looked at the light on the corridor floor, the long gold strips of it between the shadows. I thought about January 14th, the cold and the blood and the sound of the glass. I thought about all the quiet weeks between that night and this afternoon. The USB drive, the library, Gerald's armchair, Thursday evenings in a room smelling of weak coffee, Patricia's documents, and Russell Page's legal pad, and Dr. Voss's hand at the end of our second session. I thought about the women who didn't have those weeks, who didn't have what I had to fill them with. Tomorrow, I said, we finish it. I didn't sleep well that night. I want to be honest about that because I've been honest about everything else, and there's no reason to stop now. I lay in the dark in my bed at 14 Birchwood Lane, and I listened to the house make its nighttime sounds. The particular creak of the second stair, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the wind moved through the gap under the back door that Gerald had been meaning to reseal the winter he died. And I thought about tomorrow with the particular quality of attention that insomnia produces, which is not useful attention but is very thorough. I thought about Dylan's face when Claire asked him about the power of attorney, and he said he didn't have an answer. I had been watching him in those moments, in the spaces between questions when he thought no one was particularly focused on him, and I had seen something that I was still trying to understand. Not quite remorse, not quite shame, something more unsettled than either of those things. Like a man who had built a structure over a period of years and was only now, sitting in a courtroom under fluorescent lighting, genuinely reckoning with what the structure was made of. I didn't know what to do with that. There wasn't anything to do with it that didn't involve undoing something I couldn't afford to undo. But I held it anyway, the way you hold things that don't have a clean resolution, carefully, at a slight distance, without pretending it isn't there. At some point after 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen and made chamomile tea that I didn't particularly want, and sat at the table with it and pulled Patricia's most recent foundation documents toward me and read through the section on program design for the 3rd time. It helped, actually. Not because the content was distracting, but because it reminded me why I was doing this. Not the legal case, not the protective order, not any of the specific mechanisms of the fight. The reason underneath all of it. The thing that made sense of the energy I was spending. Beverly. Miriam. P. With her folded hands and her silence. Every woman who had sat in Denise's circle and described, in halting or matter-of-fact or barely controlled emotional terms, the experience of being financially dismantled by the people who were supposed to love them. Every woman who had walked out of that situation with nothing, or close to nothing, because she hadn't had the tools to walk out with anything else. I fell asleep sometime after 3 with the foundation documents still on the table. I woke up at 5:43 exactly, as always, and got up and made real coffee, and got dressed and drove to the courthouse without eating breakfast, which I regretted by 9:30, but managed. Court reconvened at 9 o'clock sharp. Judge Ellsworth came in with the same contained impatience expression she had worn the day before, which I had decided meant she was a person who never wasted a morning on theater. She settled her reading glasses on her nose, looked at the room, and said, "Before we proceed, I want to note for the record that I've reviewed the forensic signature analysis in its entirety, as well as the supplementary financial documentation submitted yesterday afternoon. Counsel, we will address the motion for interim financial controls first. Mr. Fitch." Gordon Fitch stood. He had the look of a man who had worked late and slept in sections. "Your Honor, the defense maintains that any financial controls placed on Mr. Mercer or his wife at this stage would constitute prejudicial action prior to a finding of liability, and we request—" "The foundation of your client's counterclaim," Judge Ellsworth interrupted, in the tone of someone who has already completed the sentence in her head and is only partially listening to the version being produced out loud, was that the plaintiff lacked the cognitive capacity to make sound financial decisions. That counterclaim has been evaluated and found without clinical support. The plaintiff restructured her assets through proper legal channels with competent professional assistance. There is no viable claim to those assets." She looked at him over her glasses. "What I'm considering controls on, Mr. Fitch, are your client's own financial activities, given the evidence of the forged document and the recorded attempts to access the plaintiff's accounts without authorization. Are we clear on the distinction?" A short pause. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good. Then let's not waste each other's morning." What happened over the next 4 hours was methodical, in the way that consequential things sometimes are. Not dramatic, not operatic, just the careful and relentless application of documented truth to a situation that had been built on the opposite of truth. Claire presented the full sequence of financial interference: the calls to Patricia's firm, the title inquiry, the LLC, the forged power of attorney, additional documentation that Russell Page's investigation had surfaced in the weeks since I'd first met with him, including a draft email on Dylan's personal account, recovered through the criminal investigation subpoena, in which he had outlined to Vanessa a 3-stage plan for securing the Birchwood property that had been written 14 months before January 14th. 14 months. He had been planning this for 14 months before the night on the patio, before the glass broke, before I sat in my bathroom with a washcloth pressed to my arm and first understood what I was actually dealing with. When Claire read sections of that email into the record, I kept my face very still and my hands flat on the table, and I looked at a point slightly above Judge Ellsworth's head. Not because I was suppressing emotion, I had processed most of what I was feeling about this in the preceding weeks, but because I understood that my job in this room was to be the stable center of this story. Everything else was moving. I needed to not move. Vanessa testified that morning. She was composed in the particular way of someone who has decided that composure is her best available strategy, which it probably was. She answered questions in complete, measured sentences. She denied knowledge of the forged signature. She described herself as a devoted daughter-in-law who had been trying to help her husband manage a difficult family situation. She said the word difficult 8 times in 40 minutes, which told me that it was the word her attorney had chosen as the safest container for the reality of things. When Claire cross-examined her, she asked about the draft email, about the 3-stage plan, about the phrase Dylan had used in the email. Once we have access, she won't be in a position to contest, and asked Vanessa to explain what access referred to in that context. Vanessa said she didn't recall the specific email. Claire introduced a screenshot of the email with Vanessa's name in the CC line. Vanessa had been copied on it. She had received it. Her account had opened it, according to the server records that had been produced through the subpoena. A pause that went on too long. "I receive a great many emails," Vanessa said. "This one discusses a plan to acquire your mother-in-law's property," Claire said. "I'd imagine that was somewhat distinct from routine correspondence." Judge Ellsworth made a note. It was around 11 that Gordon Fitch requested a brief recess to confer with his clients. Judge Ellsworth granted 15 minutes. Claire and I sat at our table while Marcus went to get water, And I watched, without trying to appear to watch, as Fitch leaned between Dylan and Vanessa at their table and spoke in a rapid, quiet undertone with the focused urgency of a man trying to accomplish something difficult in a narrow window of time. Dylan's jaw was working again. Vanessa was very still. Claire leaned toward me slightly. "He's talking to them about settlement," she said quietly. "Already?" "The email is worse for them than the footage, in some ways. The footage is physical. The email is premeditation. Juries and judges respond differently to things that were written down in advance." She glanced at their table. "Fitch is smart. He can see where this is heading." "What do we do if they propose settlement?" She looked at me. "What do you want to do?" I thought about it. Not the reflexive thought, not the part of me that was tired and would have considered almost anything that ended this faster, but the real thought, the one underneath. "I want the criminal investigation to proceed," I said. "Whatever happens civilly, I want that to be separate." "It is separate. We don't control the DA's timeline." "Then civilly," I paused. "I don't want a settlement that requires me to sign anything that characterizes this as a misunderstanding. I don't want Vanessa's word, whatever word she wants to use, to be the final version of what happened." Claire nodded slowly. "Then we tell them the civil settlement, if they propose one, needs to include an acknowledgement of the conduct. Not a full admission, their attorney won't allow that, but language that doesn't erase what happened. And no confidentiality clause," I said. "Whatever is resolved, I want to be able to talk about it, not for publicity, for the foundation. For the women I work with on Thursday nights who need to know that this kind of thing can be named and addressed." Claire looked at me for a moment with the expression she sometimes had when I said something that recalibrated what she had been expecting. "All right," she said, "no confidentiality." Court reconvened. Gordon Fitch did not immediately propose a settlement that, I learned from Claire later, would happen through proper channels, not in open court. What he did instead was request a 1-week continuance to allow his clients time to explore resolution options. Judge Ellsworth granted 3 days. She also, in the same breath and without visible ceremony, issued an interim order freezing Dylan and Vanessa's financial accounts above a minimum operating threshold, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. She cited the forged document and the email as grounds. I watched Dylan's face when the freeze was announced. He absorbed it the way people absorb things they have been told to expect, but still find stunning when they arrive. Vanessa's expression did not change, which was its own kind of revelation. The discipline of a woman who has already moved to whatever the next position is, even when the current position is collapsing. We were outside the courthouse by 1 in the afternoon. The April day was clear and cool, the kind of Ohio spring day that feels like an apology for winter. Claire walked with me to my car, and we stood in the parking lot for a few minutes and talked through the next 3 days. "They'll come with something by tomorrow," she said. "Fitch moves fast when he's trying to limit damage. What will they offer? Withdrawal of the competency counterclaim, agreement to cease all contact formalized beyond the protective order, probably some acknowledgement of financial harm with a monetary component. Though given that your assets are already protected and they don't have access to much right now, the number may be modest." "I don't want their money," I said. "That's not what this was about." "I know. But consider this. Any monetary judgment or settlement that gets structured properly can go directly to the foundation. It becomes operational funding rather than personal compensation." I thought about that. "All right," I said, "on that condition." She nodded. "I'll be in touch by this evening." I drove home slowly, taking the long route without consciously deciding to, the one that went past the middle school where I had taught for 31 years. I hadn't driven past it in a while. It looked the same as it always had. The brick facade, the marquee sign out front with its movable letters spelling out something about spring sports registration, the long row of windows along the second floor where the math classrooms were. I had spent more of my waking hours in that building than almost anywhere else. I had spent 31 years standing in front of rooms full of 12 and 13-year-olds trying to make them understand that numbers had logic to them, that the logic was reliable, that if you followed the rules of how things worked, you could trust the outcome. I had believed that. I still believed it. I just understood now that the rules I'd been talking about applied more broadly than mathematics. The foundation papers were still on my kitchen table when I got home. I made a sandwich I mostly ate and a cup of coffee. I finished completely and I sat with the papers for an hour, not reading them exactly, but present with them, thinking about what they represented and what they would become. The Mercer Renewal Foundation. I had settled on that name 3 weeks earlier for reasons that were simpler than they might sound. It had my name in it, which I had initially resisted. There's a particular discomfort in putting your own name on something, a slight embarrassment of presumption. But Patricia had pointed out sensibly that the name was also a signal, that there might be women who knew what the name referred to, what the circumstances behind it were, and that for those women the name itself might carry meaning, might communicate something that a more neutral name wouldn't. She was right about that. She usually was. I spent the afternoon working through the program design section again, this time with a legal pad of my own, making notes in the margins and writing questions I needed to answer in the next few weeks. The housing component was the most complex, partnering with existing organizations rather than building infrastructure from scratch, at least initially. The legal support component was more straightforward. Claire had already connected me with 2 attorneys who did elder law pro bono work and were interested in formalizing the relationship through the foundation. The educational component was where I had the most to contribute directly, having spent 3 decades teaching people who were told they weren't capable. Claire called at 6:15. Fitch reached out, she said. They want to meet tomorrow at 10, his office. What tone? Businesslike, not conciliatory. He's not coming to apologize. He's coming to calculate. Which is fine. That's the version of this I can work with. Do we know what they're bringing? Withdrawal of the competency claim. Full release of any and all claims to your property or estate. An agreed statement of conduct. We'll fight for the language. And a number. She named it. I was quiet for a moment. It was not a large number in the context of what they had tried to do. But money had never been the point. Condition stands, I said. It goes to the foundation. Understood. And Evelyn, there's one more thing. Tell me. The DA's office contacted me this afternoon. Russell Page, the criminal investigation has progressed to the point where they're considering formal charges, elder abuse, financial fraud, document forgery. He wanted me to prepare you that an indictment may be coming in the next 30 to 60 days, independent of whatever we resolve civilly. I sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it. Criminal charges against my son. The kind of thing that, once it existed, would exist permanently in records and databases and the documented history of Dylan James Mercer's life. Is there anything I can do to affect that timeline? I asked. No, and honestly, you shouldn't try. The criminal process is separate from your interests now. It belongs to the state. I know. I paused. I want you to know that I understand what that means. For him. And I'm not... I stopped. You're not what? I'm not glad, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not glad any of this happened. I'm not glad about where it's going. I think what they did was wrong, and I think there need to be consequences. And I would do everything I've done exactly the same way if I had to do it again. But I am not glad. Claire was quiet for a moment on her end of the line. I know, she said, and for what it's worth, that's the right way to feel about it. I had a hard time sleeping again that night, though for different reasons than the night before. Not anxiety. Something more complicated. The particular restlessness that comes from a long thing approaching its end, from the sense that you are close enough to the other side that you can almost feel the different quality of air there, but you're not through yet. And the distance between almost and through is not nothing. I thought about Dylan at 11 years old falling asleep in the back seat of the car on the drive home from his grandmother's house in Michigan. The particular way children sleep in cars, completely, without reservation, trusting entirely in the forward motion of the vehicle and the person driving it. I had always loved that image of him, that specific, particular trust. I did not know, lying in the dark, whether I would ever have a relationship with my son again. That was the honest truth. I did not know whether the person who had written a 14-month plan to secure the Birchwood property and who had stood in my broken doorframe and let me bleed in the snow was someone who could be reached in the eventual future by something better than what he had been. I did not know whether the damage was the kind that healed or the kind that simply scars over and stays. What I knew was that whether or not he healed was his work to do, not mine. I had spent 41 years being responsible for Dylan's well-being in one way or another, and that was over now. Not because I had stopped loving him, because loving him did not require me to absorb what he had done without consequence. Those two things were separate. I had been confusing them for a very long time. The meeting at Fitch's office the next morning lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. His office was on the 7th floor of a downtown building, clean-lined and neutral in the way of offices that are designed to project authority without revealing anything about the person who occupies them. Fitch himself was more subdued than he had been in court, not defeated exactly, but recalibrated. He was a professional who had assessed the situation and was operating accordingly, which I found easier to deal with than the theatrical version of him. Dylan and Vanessa were not present. That had been one of Claire's conditions, and Fitch had agreed without visible resistance. It was just the four of us, Fitch, his associate, Claire, and me, around a conference table with water glasses no one touched, and a stack of draft documents at the center. They opened with the numbers and terms Fitch had communicated the previous evening. We opened with our response, which included Claire's proposed language for the acknowledgement of conduct. What followed was 2 hours of careful, detailed negotiation of specific words and specific sentences, the kind of work that looks like hair splitting from the outside and is, in fact, the whole substance of the thing. Fitch pushed back hardest on the conduct language. He wanted phrasing like actions that caused unintended harm. Claire wanted a pattern of conduct including financial coercion, unauthorized use of the plaintiff's identity, and physical conduct resulting in injury. We landed somewhere in the middle after 40 minutes on that single paragraph. Language that named the categories of conduct without using the word intentional in relation to the physical incident, which was the one concession Claire had told me in advance she was willing to make. I sat through most of it without speaking. That was not my role in the room. My role was to be present and to signal, through my presence, that I was not going to be moved by the pressure of proximity or the passage of time into accepting less than what we had agreed to accept. Fitch glanced at me periodically in the way of a man checking the temperature of the room, and each time he found the same temperature, which was steady. Near the end of the second hour, something shifted. Fitch had been pushing on the confidentiality clause again. He had returned to it 3 times, each time with a slightly different framing, and Claire had declined each time, and I had watched his persistence with the particular attention of a woman who taught mathematics for 31 years and understood that when someone keeps trying the same approach, it is either because they believe they will eventually wear you down or because they don't have a different approach to try. He didn't have a different approach. On his 3rd attempt, I spoke. "Mr. Fitch." He looked at me. "I want to explain something to you because I think it will save us time. I run a foundation that works with women who have been financially exploited by their families. I speak about this experience, not the specific legal details, but the shape of it, because the women I work with need to understand that these situations can be addressed. I'm not willing to sign anything that prevents me from doing that work, not for any amount of money, and not for any other consideration. If that's a condition your clients need, then we don't have an agreement today." Fitch looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at his documents. Then he drew a line through the confidentiality clause and initialed beside it. "Fine," he said. We signed at 2:30 in the afternoon. Not the final documentation, that would take another 2 weeks to formalize, but the term sheet that established what the final documentation would contain. I signed my name the way I always signed my name, the capital E curving in the direction it had always curved, the final R of Mercer falling the way it had always fallen. Outside in the elevator, Claire exhaled slowly. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of a woman who had been holding her professional composure at a specific level of tension for 9 months and had just been permitted to relax it by a few degrees. "The foundation language in the settlement structure," she said, as the elevator descended. "Once that's formalized, the incoming funds are protected under the charitable designation. They're operational from day 1. "Good," I said. "Patricia will want to move on the board appointments as well. You have 3 nominations pending. I'll call her this week." The elevator opened. We walked through the lobby. Outside, the April afternoon had warmed slightly from the morning, and the light was the kind that makes ordinary things, parking meters, building facades, the ordinary gray of a Midwestern downtown, look briefly like they deserve more attention than you'd normally give them. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to my car, just standing there, which is not something I typically do. But I needed one moment of just standing still and feeling the specific weight of this specific day before I moved on to whatever came next. What came next was a great deal, as it turned out. In the weeks that followed, the criminal investigation proceeded along its own track, independent of anything I controlled. Russell Page called once to inform me that the grand jury had been convened and that my testimony from the civil proceedings had been formally introduced. He was careful, in the way he had always been careful, not to give me more information than I needed or was entitled to, which I respected. The waiting was hard. Not as hard as the waiting before the trial, but hard in its own way. The particular difficulty of having done what you could do and now having to trust the process that took it from there. The formal settlement documents arrived on a Thursday. I signed them at Claire's office in the morning, before that evening's group at Denise's community center. I went directly from Claire's office to the community center, which meant I was still in the dark blue blazer when I walked into the room smelling of cleaning products and weak coffee. Denise looked at me. "You look like you went somewhere important today." "I did," I said. I didn't elaborate and she didn't push. That was one of the things I valued about Denise. She understood that people told their stories in the order they were ready to tell them, and that the pushing never helped. Beverly was there that evening, and Miriam and P with her folded hands. There were two women I hadn't met before. A woman named June, who was 63 and had recently discovered that her stepson had been forging checks on her account for 2 years, and a woman named Carol, who had driven 40 minutes from outside the county because someone at her senior center had told her about the group. Carol was 76 and spoke very quietly and kept her coat on for the entire session, even though the room was warm enough. I watched Carol across the circle, the way she held herself, carefully, like someone protecting something that had already been hurt once and couldn't afford another hit. I recognized that posture. I had worn it myself. At the end of the session, when people were gathering their things, Carol came and sat in the chair beside me. She didn't say anything for a moment. She had the look of someone working up to something. "I heard from Denise that you're starting something," she said. "A foundation." "Yes." "For women like us." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "My son took my car. I can't get to my doctor appointments anymore. I've been taking the bus, but it doesn't go all the way. I have to walk the last part, and it's a lot. In the cold." I looked at her, 76 years old, wearing her coat indoors because she had learned to keep herself covered, walking the last part of the route to her own doctor in the Ohio winter because her son had taken her car. "The foundation isn't officially operational yet," I said, "but I have resources. Can I get your contact information?" She looked at me like I had offered her something that required verification before she allowed herself to believe it was real, which, I understood, it probably did. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can." I drove home that evening through streets that were dark and familiar and mine, in a way they had always been mine, but that I felt more clearly now. Not just the streets, but the city, the life, the accumulated texture of 72 years in this particular geography. I had been born 20 miles from where I was driving. I had built everything I had within a radius of 60 miles. And I had nearly lost all of it to the two people who had the most reason to protect it. But nearly is not the same as actually. And the distance between those two words is exactly the space where a life gets rebuilt. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table with the foundation documents and a legal pad, and I wrote Carol's name at the top of the first page. Then I wrote June's name. Then I wrote Beverly's name and Miriam's name, and after a moment, simply a P with a dash after it, because I still didn't know her full name and she hadn't offered it and I wasn't going to push. 5 names. The beginning of something. The final settlement amounts cleared 2 weeks later. Patricia called to confirm that the incoming funds had been received by the foundation account and were immediately available for programming. The number was not large in the way that I had imagined, once, that large numbers needed to be. But it was real, and it was documented. And it was the direct financial consequence of what Dylan and Vanessa had done, transformed now into something that would help people they had never considered and would never meet. There is a particular satisfaction in that kind of alchemy. I am not going to pretend there isn't. I had not spoken to Dylan since the afternoon I'd stood at my screen door and told him the house was mine. That was 4 months ago now. I didn't know what I expected to feel about that silence at this point in the process, but what I actually felt was complicated in ways I was still learning to navigate. There was grief in it, real grief, the kind that doesn't resolve just because you've made the right decisions. There was also something I could only call clarity, a feeling of knowing exactly where I was standing and exactly why, which was different from happiness, but was its own kind of solid ground. The house was still mine. The pear tree was blooming, late April in Ohio, the small white blossoms opening in the way they always did, slightly too soon for the temperature, slightly stubborn about it. Gerald's tree. Still producing, still insisting on itself despite the cold and the unpredictable season. I stood at the back window one evening and looked at it for a long time. I thought about the foundation's first board meeting, scheduled for the following Tuesday. I thought about Carol and the 40-minute drive she made to sit in Denise's room because she needed to know she wasn't alone. I thought about the housing partnerships Claire was developing and the 2 attorneys who were coming on board, and Patricia's forecast for the foundation's 5-year sustainability, which was, as Patricia always was, precise and cautiously optimistic. I thought about what it meant to build something in the aftermath of destruction, not despite it, through it, using the exact materials the destruction had provided. And I thought about Dylan, my son, sitting somewhere in the city that night with whatever remained of the life he and Vanessa had built, facing a criminal process he couldn't stop, living with a version of events that was now documented in court records and signed settlement agreements, and the memory of a courtroom full of people who had watched the footage and understood what it showed. I did not wish him ill. I want to be very clear about that. I wished him something harder to name, the particular wish that the worst thing a person has done becomes, eventually, the thing they reckon with honestly. Not for my sake, for his. Because a person who doesn't reckon with the worst of themselves carries it forward, and I had spent enough of my life adjacent to that weight. Whether he would do that reckoning, I didn't know. I had stopped pretending I could know things I couldn't know. But the door, the real one, the one I'd mentioned standing at my screen door on the cold February morning when I sent him away. That door was still where I'd said it was. Not open, not closed, just where it was, for whenever the version of him that might deserve to walk through it existed. That might never happen. I had made my peace with that, or I was making it, which is the honest version of peace, not a destination, but a direction. I turned away from the window. I went to the kitchen table. I pulled the legal pad toward me, and I opened to the page where I'd written the 5 names. Then I picked up the pen, and I kept going. The grand jury returned an indictment on the 3rd Tuesday of June. I found out the way I found out most things by that point. From Claire, who called at 8:40 in the morning while I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and the foundation's first quarterly report, which Patricia had sent over the previous afternoon, and which I had been reading with the particular pleasure of someone watching a thing they imagined become a thing that exists. Claire said the words in the direct, unadorned way she said everything. The grand jury had returned a true bill. Formal charges had been filed against both Dylan James Mercer and Vanessa Ann Cole. Arraignment was scheduled for the following Thursday. I set down my coffee cup. I looked out the back window at the pear tree, which was in full summer leaf by now, green and dense and completely uninterested in the weight of what I was holding. "What are the charges?" I asked. Claire listed them. Elder abuse in the 1st degree, financial fraud, document forgery. Conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. 4 charges against Dylan, 3 against Vanessa. The elder abuse charge applied to Dylan alone, given the footage. I sat with that list for a moment. Elder abuse in the 1st degree. My son. Those words applied to my son. Evelyn. Claire's voice was careful. Not soft. She was never soft, but careful. "I know this is hard." "It is," I said. "It also isn't. That's the part I can't explain cleanly." "You don't have to explain it." "I know." I looked at the tree. "What do I need to do?" "Nothing right now. The criminal case runs on its own track. You may be called as a witness if it goes to trial, but that's months away at minimum, and there's significant likelihood they'll negotiate a plea rather than face what's in the record." She paused. "Focus on what you're building. That's where your energy belongs right now." She was right. She usually was. I put the phone down and sat for a while with the weight of the morning. I want to be honest here about what that sitting felt like, because I think it matters. Because the version of this story where the indictment arrives and the protagonist feels only satisfaction and vindication is a clean version, and clean versions are almost never true. What I felt was layered and uncomfortable and did not resolve into a single emotion. There was relief, yes. There was the specific relief of an official body looking at the same facts I had been living with for 6 months and arriving at the same conclusion about what those facts meant. There was something that in a different context I might have called justice, though the word always feels larger than the reality it describes. But underneath that, and around it, and woven through it in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, was grief. Plain, heavy, unremarkable grief. The grief of a woman who had spent 41 years loving a person who had turned out to be capable of this. The grief of understanding that love, even the most genuine kind, doesn't prevent people from becoming what they decide to become. That you can do everything right, every school lunch, every Sunday call, every year of showing up, and still end up with a grand jury indictment on a Tuesday morning in June. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you because I think it's important to be clear that doing the right thing and feeling good about it are not always the same event. Sometimes the right thing is also the hardest thing and the most painful thing and the thing you will carry for the rest of your life in a way that never fully lightens. Doing it anyway is not nothing, but it is not painless either. The board meeting for the Mercer Renewal Foundation's second quarter happened that Friday. We met in a conference room at a nonprofit center downtown that allowed small organizations to use its space for meetings. A practical, deliberately unglamorous room with folding chairs and a whiteboard and a coffee maker in the corner that produced something technically qualifying as coffee. I had specifically chosen not to rent a formal office or impressive-looking venue for this meeting because the women we were building this for did not need to be reminded of the distance between where they were and where the institutions were. They needed to be reminded that the institution was, this time, on their side. Our board was 6 people. Patricia, who had agreed to serve as treasurer after some gentle arm twisting on my part that she had pretended required more twisting than it actually did. Claire, in an advisory capacity. Denise from the Thursday group, who brought a year's deep practical understanding of what these women actually needed versus what well-meaning organizations often imagined they needed. A woman named Robert Sung, who ran a housing nonprofit on the East Side and had become, over the previous 3 months, someone I considered a genuine collaborator. A retired judge named Francis Wills, who had spent 20 years on the family court bench and whose understanding of the legal landscape these women navigated was both comprehensive and unsparing. And Howard, the librarian, who had quietly told me when I asked him that he'd spent his whole career helping people find things they didn't know they were looking for, and that this seemed like more of the same, only bigger. We went through the quarterly report for 2 hours. The numbers were modest but real. 14 women served in the first 3 months of formal operation. 8 legal referrals made, 6 of which had resulted in active representation. 3 housing placements facilitated. 1 woman, Carol, the one with the coat and the 40-minute bus ride, had her legal situation resolved well enough within 2 months that she was able to reclaim her car and reduce her dependence on the bus to a manageable level. She had called me the morning after the resolution to tell me she had driven herself to her doctor's appointment for the first time in 8 months, and I had stood in my kitchen holding the phone and felt something so specific and uncomplicated and good that I had trouble naming it afterward, which was unusual for me. I described that phone call to the board. Francis Wills, who I had not yet seen show much visible emotion about anything, looked out the window for a moment before looking back at the whiteboard. Robert Sung said quietly, "That's why." "Yes," I said. "That's why." After the meeting, Denise stayed behind to help me stack the folding chairs. She was a woman who always stayed to help with the physical labor of a thing, which told you something accurate about her. We worked in comfortable silence for a moment, and then she said without looking at me, "Have you decided about the house?" I had been thinking about the house for 3 weeks. I had been thinking about it with the same methodical attention I had brought to every other decision over the past 6 months, going over the angles of it at night when I couldn't sleep, and on my morning walks and in the odd, quiet moments between other things. "Yes," I said. She looked at me now. "And?" "I'm going to sell it," I said. "Not right away, but by the end of the year probably." The foundation will receive the proceeds, and I'm going to find somewhere smaller, somewhere that takes less out of me to maintain. Denise was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? It was the question I had been asking myself. I tried to answer it honestly. Like I thought I would feel worse, I said. Like the house was the thing they wanted, and I spent all this time protecting it, and now I'm choosing to let it go. And I thought that would feel like loss. But it mostly feels like completion. Like the house was always going to end up as something that helped people, just not the people who tried to take it. Denise nodded slowly. Gerald would have liked that, I think, based on what you've told me about him. He would have complained about the paperwork, I said, and then he would have liked it. She laughed. It was a good laugh, real and unpretentious, and it made the room feel briefly lighter. We finished stacking the chairs. The arraignment happened the following Thursday. I did not attend. Claire had offered to go, to represent my interests in the room in whatever capacity was relevant, but I had decided against it. I did not need to be in that courtroom. I had already been in a courtroom, and I had said what I needed to say, and the rest of it was process. The legal system doing the heavy work that legal systems exist to do. What I did instead that Thursday morning was drive to the community center and set up the chairs for the evening group before anyone else arrived. Denise got there at 10:30 and found me arranging the circle, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who has learned to read the shape of other people's significant days. Today's the day, she said. Yes. You okay? Getting there, I said, which was true in the specific, non-performative way that mattered. I was in motion toward okay, which is the most honest version of that state I know. What Claire told me later about the arraignment was this. Both Dylan and Vanessa had appeared with their respective attorneys, Gordon Fitch for Dylan, a new attorney named Harriet Dean for Vanessa, which told me that somewhere in the preceding weeks they had begun to recognize that their interests might not be identical and that they might need separate representation. Both had entered pleas of not guilty, which was standard and expected and meant nothing yet about how the case would ultimately resolve. Bail had been set. The next hearing was in 8 weeks, and Vanessa, Claire told me, had arrived at the arraignment without her wedding ring. I sat with that detail for a while when Claire mentioned it. Not with satisfaction, or not primarily with satisfaction. With something more complicated. With the recognition that the structure Dylan and Vanessa had built together, the one that had been pointed at my house and my assets and my life, was itself now coming apart under the pressure of its own consequences. That the thing they had done together was now the thing pulling them apart. I did not know whether they had formally separated. It wasn't information I sought out, but the missing ring told a story of its own, about what happens to a partnership when the scheme that held it together stops working. The plea negotiations began 6 weeks after the arraignment. Russell Page kept me informed at the level I needed to be informed. Not every detail, but the shape of it, the direction. Dylan's attorney and the DA's office were talking. The evidence was extensive and well documented, and Gordon Fitch was, at his core, a pragmatist. A trial meant the footage would be shown again, the email would be read again, the forgery analysis would be presented again, and the outcome was unlikely to improve for his client through that process. A negotiated plea offered this possibility of some mitigation. The call I had been waiting for without quite knowing I was waiting for it came on a Monday morning in late July. It was not from Claire or Russell Page. It was from a number I recognized but had not answered in 7 months. Dylan. I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. The protective order had been modified 6 weeks earlier at my request. I had asked Claire to add a provision allowing written or phone contact if I initiated it or explicitly permitted it. I hadn't known at the time whether I would ever use that provision. I had added it anyway, because I didn't want a legal document to be the only thing determining the boundaries between my son and me. I wanted that to be my choice. I let it ring twice more. Then I answered. Dylan. A pause on his end, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, Mom. His voice was different from the last time I had heard it. The tight, over-controlled quality was gone. What was left was something rawer and more uncertain, like a voice that has recently been through something and hasn't finished processing the journey. I'm here, I said. Another pause. My attorney says I'm not supposed to discuss the case. He stopped. So I'm not calling about the case. All right. I'm calling because he stopped again. I waited. I had learned over the past 7 months that waiting was often the most precise tool available. I don't know if there's anything I can say that means anything. I know there probably isn't. I know I can't. I don't have a version of this where what I did is explainable. No, I said. You don't. I know that. The silence that followed had a different texture from the earlier silences. Something working through it. Something unfinished and genuine and not yet resolved into clean language. I keep thinking about the night of the door, he said finally. I keep thinking about the moment, the specific moment, where I could have stopped, where I could have said, this is enough. This has gone far enough. I'm not going to... He broke off. I didn't stop. I know I didn't stop. I don't know how to... He exhaled. I don't know what I'm asking you for. You're not asking me for anything, I said. You're telling me something. Those are different. A long pause. Yeah, he said. I guess they are. I looked out the back window at the pear tree. August in Ohio. The green at its deepest, the fullest the tree got before the slow turn toward fall. Gerald's tree. Still there. Dylan, I said, I'm not able to give you absolution. I'm not able to tell you that what happened didn't happen, or that it's over, or that we're all right, because none of that would be true. I kept my voice level, not cold. What I can tell you is that I don't want your punishment to be the end of the story for you. That's the honest truth. I want you to do whatever the work is, the real work. Not for me, for yourself. Because the version of you that this is not the only version that's possible, and whether you get to be a different version depends entirely on whether you decide that matters. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, not in a manipulative way, just smaller. I don't know how to do that. I know, I said. But not knowing how to start is different from not starting. You figure it out by starting. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes, not saying much. The conversation had reached the place where the essential things had been said, and what remained was the ordinary ambient noise of two people who share a history and are no longer sure what they share. We said goodbye without making any promises, because there were no promises appropriate to make in that moment. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and stood for a while with my hands flat on the surface of it. I didn't know what that call meant for the future. I still don't, sitting here telling you this story. I don't know whether Dylan will do the work he said he didn't know how to do. I don't know whether Vanessa, who never called, not once, and whose silence told its own clear story, will ever reckon honestly with what she designed. I don't know whether the foundation will grow the way I believe it can, or whether the legal structures I built will outlast the challenges that will inevitably come, or whether Carol will stay safe and Beverly will recover fully and P will one day find her way to complete sentences again. What I know is what I did, and I want to tell you what I know, directly, the way I've been trying to tell you everything in this story, without ornament, without the reassuring fictions that stories sometimes use to make their endings feel more complete than real life allows. I know that I got up off the pavers in the January snow, and I wrapped my own arm, and I locked the bathroom door, and I made a choice about what kind of woman I was going to be for whatever years I have remaining. I know that I called Claire Donovan in the morning, and I didn't look away from what the footage showed, and I didn't allow myself to reframe the unacceptable into something I could live with more easily. I know that I protected what was mine, not out of spite, not as revenge, but because what was mine was also the instrument of something larger, and I had a responsibility to that larger thing that outweighed my discomfort with conflict. I know that the plea agreement was finalized in September. Dylan received 3 years of supervised probation, mandatory participation in an elder abuse intervention program, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent civil order prohibiting him from any involvement in my financial or legal affairs for the remainder of my life. Vanessa, whose attorney had negotiated separately and whose culpability on the physical incident was more limited, received 18 months of probation, mandatory financial ethics counseling, and the complete surrender of every claim, documented, implied, or potential, to any asset connected to my estate. They did not go to prison. I want to be clear that I had no say in that determination, and that I had made my peace with the range of possible outcomes before the negotiations concluded. The criminal justice system makes its own calculations, and the calculations it made in this case reflected the evidence, the cooperation, and whatever Russell Page and the DA's office determined served the broader interest. I am not in a position to second-guess that, and I have not tried to. What I care about, the thing that matters to me more than any specific sentencing number, is that it is in the record. All of it. The email, the forgery, the footage, the 14-month plan, and the LLC and the calls to Patricia's firm and the January night on the patio. It is documented and adjudicated and part of the permanent record of what occurred. No one can rewrite it now. No one can call it a misunderstanding or an accident or a difficult family situation. It is what it was, named precisely, filed permanently. That matters to me more than I expected it to. The house at 14 Birchwood Lane sold in November. The buyer was a young couple, early 30s, first home, the kind of barely contained nervous excitement that makes people slightly too eager in ways that are entirely forgivable. They walked through the house 3 times before making an offer. The wife spent 15 minutes in the backyard, which I noticed from the kitchen window. She was looking at the pear tree. When the realtor called to tell me the offer had come in, she mentioned, as a detail she thought I'd find charming, that the wife had asked specifically about the pear tree, whether it produced fruit, how old it was, whether it would stay. I told the realtor to tell her it would stay, it was very old, and it was stubborn about producing fruit in years when you'd almost given up on it. But it produced. Every year without exception, it produced. I signed the closing documents on a cold afternoon in late November. In the closing attorney's office, with the heat running and the fluorescent lights and the smell of old carpet that seemed to follow legal proceedings everywhere, I signed my name one last time on a document related to 14 Birchwood Lane. The capital E curving the way it had always curved, the final R of Mercer falling the way it had always fallen. Then I handed back the pen, and the house was no longer mine, and I felt, not loss, something closer to completion. The word I had used with Denise back in June, when I had been uncertain it was true and was testing it out loud to see how it fit. It fit. Not because endings are good in themselves, but because this particular ending was honest, and what it led to was real, and sometimes that is enough. The proceeds went to the foundation, as I had arranged. Patricia called the morning the transfer cleared to give me the number, stated in her clean, unembellished way. It was a substantial number. It meant the Foundation's housing program could expand to serve 3 times the number of women we had originally projected for the first year. It meant the legal referral program could add 2 additional attorneys on partial retainer. It meant that the small folding chair room at the nonprofit center could stay exactly what it was, unglamorous, accessible, on the side of the people who needed it, for as long as we needed it to be. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Covington in December. Smaller, as I had said I would. 2nd floor, with a good-sized window in the living room that caught the afternoon light in a way I liked. I took Gerald's armchair, which fit in the corner near the window exactly as if the apartment had been designed around it. I did not take most of the other furniture. Some of it went to Beverly, who was rebuilding from a more stripped-down starting point than she deserved. Some of it went to June, the woman with the forged checks, who had found a new apartment and was furnishing it with a combination of determination and very limited resources. The first morning I woke up in the apartment, I lay in the unfamiliar dark and waited for the grief of the house to arrive. It came, but it was quieter than I expected. A minor key, not the major one I had been braced for. The house had been my home for 37 years, and it would always have been my home for 37 years. And now it was something else to someone else. And those 2 facts could coexist without either one canceling the other. I got up at 5:43, as always. I made coffee. I stood at the window with the cup in both hands and watched the winter morning come in from the east over the Covington rooftops, gray and slow and entirely indifferent to the significance I was placing on it. Good, I thought. That's as it should be. It is spring again now, as I tell you this. The 2nd spring since the night on the patio. The Foundation has served 81 women in its first full year of operation. 81 women who came to us with some version of the same wound, the wound of having been decided against by people who were supposed to be on their side, and who left with something more than they came with. Not always as much as they deserved. The system is imperfect, the resources are never quite enough, and there are outcomes that don't resolve cleanly, no matter how much work we put in. But 81 women who know they are not alone, and who have access to tools they didn't have before, and whose situations are at minimum better documented and better understood and more actively defended than they were. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. I want to speak to you now directly, not as a storyteller, as a person who has been inside this particular experience and has come out the other side with something to say. If you are watching this, if you have stayed with me this far, then I believe something in this story landed close to something in your own life. Maybe not identically, maybe not even closely, but something. A person who treated you like an obstacle instead of a human being, a family member who looked at what you had and calculated how to get it. A moment where you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself. I want to tell you what I know about that choice. The peace you keep by surrendering yourself is not peace. It is postponement. It is the quiet you get in a room where all the windows are sealed and the pressure is building and no one is willing to be the one to open a window because opening a window would change the temperature of the room, and everyone has agreed to pretend the temperature is fine. That room is not peaceful. That room is a sealed, pressurizing space that will eventually make it impossible to breathe. And the person who will stop breathing first is you, because you are the one who decided to protect everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own oxygen. Open the window. I know how frightening it is. I know the specific terror of being 72 years old and realizing that the person you raised is capable of treating you as a means to an end. I know what it feels like to have the floor move under everything you thought was solid. Your understanding of your child, your belief in your own family, your certainty that love meant something that would hold through any difficulty. I know what it costs to let go of that certainty, because letting go of it means admitting that you were wrong about something fundamental. And being wrong about something that fundamental when you are in your 70s, after a life of trying to do right by the people around you, is one of the loneliest feelings I have ever experienced. But here is what I also know. The woman who is willing to be honest about what is happening to her, who can look at the blood on the snow and the cold face of her daughter-in-law and say, out loud and to the right people, this is what this is. That woman is not weak. She is doing the hardest possible version of strength, which is the version that doesn't look like strength from the outside. The version that looks like an old woman walking to her car in a parking lot on a January morning with a USB drive in her pocket and a decision forming behind her eyes. You have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to say no. You have the right to put your name on legal documents that say this belongs to me, and it will continue to belong to me, and the people who wish otherwise will need to go through formal channels to register that wish. You have the right to love someone and also to stop allowing that love to be used against you. Those are not contradictory rights. They coexist. They are both yours, at the same time, without canceling each other. You also have the right to build something. Whatever you have, money, time, knowledge, the accumulated experience of a life that has taught you what exploitation looks like from the inside. You can turn it towards something that helps other people avoid what you went through or survive it better if they can't avoid it. The worst things that happen to us are not only damage, they are also information. They teach us something we wouldn't have known how to know without going through them. What you do with that information is the last choice the worst thing has any power over. I chose to build. I am still building. It is imperfect and slow, and there are Tuesdays where the board meetings run long and the coffee is bad, and the problem in front of us is intractable, and I am tired in the deep-bone way that 73-year-old women get tired. But I am building, and the building is real, and it will outlast me, which is the only standard that matters for something that was never really about me in the first place. The scar on my right arm is faded to a thin, pale line. I see it when I roll up my sleeves in warm weather, which in Ohio is approximately 4 months of the year. I don't cover it. I don't think about it as something to be hidden or as something to be displayed. It is just there. Part of the documented history of my body, the way all the years are documented in a body after enough time. A record of what happened. Evidence that I survived it, standing beside a lake on a clear morning last month, watching the light move on the water in the way that light on water is the most generous version of ordinary beauty. I thought about what I would tell the woman who was on her knees in the snow in January, bleeding and alone and only just beginning to understand the shape of what she was inside. I would tell her, you have more than you know. You have more in you and more around you than the people who are trying to take from you have accounted for, because they built their plan around who they decided you were, and they were wrong about you in ways they never thought to examine. They saw the house, and the quiet, and the age, and the aloneness, and they thought they saw vulnerability. They missed everything that mattered. They missed the security camera. They missed the financial advisor with 9 years of meticulous records. They missed the attorney who picks up on the third ring. They missed the 31 years of teaching rooms full of restless children to follow logic to its conclusion, to trust that precision matters more than speed, to understand that the answer exists and you find it by refusing to stop looking. They missed you. That is their mistake. And it is the mistake that costs them everything. Get up off the pavers, Evelyn. Wrap the arm. Lock the bathroom door. Sit with it for as long as you need. Then get up again in the morning at 5:43 and make your coffee and look at your pear tree and understand, with the bone-deep clarity that comes only from having been exactly this tested, that the greatest thing you will ever build is not a house or a trust or a foundation. It is the version of yourself that refused to disappear. That version is still here, still building, still adding names to a legal pad on a kitchen table, one at a time, in the early morning, in the light of a new day that belongs entirely to her. To every woman watching this who is in the middle of her own January, her own night of broken glass and cold ground, and the terrible clarity of finally understanding what someone thought you were worth. You are not finished. You are not erased. You are not what they decided you were. You are exactly what comes next.